I think one of the biggest supports for me was my husband, Dave, because one of the things he did right in the beginning was to say, if you have cancer, I have it too. And he fought it with me. He was that kind of support to me. I was only 35 years old when I found out, and it really came as a big shock because I'd always thought of myself as a very healthy person. Was very much into exercise and I thought I was eating a good diet. It was one day a year prior to this that I had found a tiny lump in my breast and immediately gone in and had a mammogram done and a follow-up ultrasound on that lump. And at that time, the radiologist assured me that that was not cancer, nothing to worry about, just a cyst. So I was really relieved, but unfortunately, over the next few months, I started experiencing pain in other parts of my body.
The first time we noticed it was we had gone to buy a turkey for Thanksgiving, and we'd gotten into a car accident. Ann and I were in the car together, and we'd been rear-ended. And after that, she started having back pain, so we associated that with the car accident.
First, it was in the middle of my back, and I'd go to exercise class, and it seemed like I pulled something, but eventually it got to the point where I know in one shoulder particularly, it felt like someone was stabbing me with a 6-inch knife over and over again.
There was a time when I had to make my bed on the floor, for one thing. It was hard for me to stay in bed with Ann because every time I turned over, it would cause excruciating pain for her. So that was really frustrating. We couldn't figure out what was going on. She wasn't getting better. We'd go to the doctor, and he wasn't able to identify what was going on.
I could see the agony she was in, and I guess as a mother, I just instinctively knew there was something very, very wrong that the doctors were not finding.
And I would literally wake up 10 times a night screaming in agony. And my husband and I decided that, listen, we have got to get another opinion here. So I remember he helped me get down to the car, and it took us 20 minutes to get from my bed to the car. And we went over to the emergency room at the hospital. And the doctor there did an examination, and he left the room, seemed kind of confused, and I found out later he'd actually called my doctor on the phone to find out if I was a hypochondriac. And I remember that day I was sent home with a bottle of Valium and instructions to start exercising more.
I knew that they were wrong. I knew that when we were put into the car and sent back home, I said, this is wrong. I told the nurse that this isn't right. Valium and more exercise isn't the way to go. This is silly.
The next day we managed one last trip in to our family doctor. And he was pretty perplexed at that point and did a pelvic exam just to see if that turned up anything, and decided that we really should be admitted to the hospital, that maybe 4 doctor friends that he was going to send over that day could find out, get to the bottom of what this was going on in my body. And they decided to put me through one test after another, and I went to x-rays, MRIs, CAT scans, you name it, I was put through it. And I remember on the 4th day of testing, I was lying on my gurney because the volunteer would have to wheel me around from one room to another. And the door opened, and this young doctor walked in the room that I'd never seen before. And he kind of had to look around in the dark like this for me. And he walked up, and I swear he said this in one breath, it seemed like to me. He walked up and said, Mrs. Fromm, I'm Dr. So-and-so. In fact, I'm a surgeon, and I'm late for surgery right now. I hate to tell you this, but you have breast cancer, and I can fit you in for mastectomy tomorrow night at 5:30, okay? Upstairs, Dave was getting the same news from a newly appointed oncologist.
He was very gently as he could, telling me that my wife had breast cancer and that it was very serious, and that when I asked, he said that people that had what she had, as bad as she had, might live another 2 years. But he said that in a guarded fashion, and we found out later that he was being very optimistic. And I was just floored. It was like I had taken my last breath and couldn't let it out. Like time had stopped, and this was all a nightmare.
It was devastating. I remember I was in my bedroom and picked up the phone in my room and said, well, we just found out I have breast cancer. Those were her words, and I was just stunned. I mean, I knew there was something else wrong with her, but I never would have guessed it was that. I was just absolutely stunned.
It was really hard for me to handle. I had lost my own mother to breast cancer. And I knew that my odds were very high, and I had had to deal with mastectomies and so forth myself. So I always lived kind of on the edge wondering if any of my daughters might have this. And when it happened, it was just a terrible experience.
Well, I was afraid for them. You know, you hear cancer and you automatically think that's the end of your friendship and their life. And I remember really being sad because I was very attached to Anne.
The next morning, I'll never forget seeing my skeleton displayed before me on this light board, and it was literally covered with tumors. I mean, there was tumors on my skull, my shoulders, my sternum here was broken. There was big spots on my ribs where the tumors had eaten right through the bone. And my pelvic bones were eaten, there was like quarter-size holes eaten right through all my pelvic bones. And the report said virtually every vertebrae of my spine had tumors growing through it. And I mean, what a shock to see that in front of me. Nothing can prepare you for that kind of thing.
We went through a deep grieving process, just let it all out and really grieve for her death.
The thing that scared me the most was that was the first time I saw my dad cry. And that just, for me, meant it was the end. So that was real hard to take.
The main thing that was going through my head was that my mom was going to die.
I thought she was going to be dead within a couple of months. I mean, it had already spread so badly at that point that I thought, I'm going to lose my sister.
She accepted it, and she just wasn't going to give up no matter what they threw at her. And the sicker she got, the more she began to fight. And I could see that there wasn't going to be any easy battle that this cancer was going to take her. It was going to be tough.
When I got home from the hospital, I found a little envelope in the mailbox. And I remember opening this up and looking at it. And it was written in crayon. And it was an invitation to my daughter's wedding. And at the bottom, where normally it says RSVP, it said, please be there. And at that moment, I knew I was going to fight with all my might, because I had a wedding to attend. Well, that night I did undergo that mastectomy. And the next day I underwent my first bag of chemotherapy, the strongest kinds they had. I mean, it was affectionately dubbed the Red Devil. And they got the biggest dose that they could possibly give me. And that was followed by several weeks of radiation to help reduce some of the larger tumors so I could begin to walk again. And they put this long 18-inch tube into my chest so they could feed more chemotherapy into my body. And every 10 days I got more doses of chemotherapy. They wanted to be as aggressive as they could at that time. And these were the only tools I knew of to fight the cancer at that time.
And she lost all her hair, and there was very little I could do to comfort her in that. And the chemotherapy robbed her of all her energy and her strength, and it was like I was living with a piano over my head, just waiting for it to fall all the time. You know, this dark cloud. Life was very difficult.
I learned so much from her. Strangely enough, she became my rock. And when I saw her go through the things she had to do, never complaining, I thought, what's the matter with her? When is she going to break? And when is she going to let this rage and anger out? And she never did. She never did. She just hung in there, and she really fought hard. I know there were times when it wasn't easy.
About 9 months into that program of every 10 days more chemotherapy, what my doctor predicted became true, and that was that my cancer built up an immunity to the chemotherapy. In other words, I built up a resistance to it, and the cancer became stronger than the chemotherapy. And I began, my cancer rate, which had been just gradually coming down, was now going up again like this. We tried a couple other kinds of chemotherapy, but they just were not touching the growth of the cancer. And my doctor said, well, there's one last hope for you, and that is to do a bone marrow transplant. Now, normally this is a procedure by which they just drill into your hip bones and take out plugs of bone marrow. And they save this all up and they freeze it. And then what they do is they give you massive doses of chemotherapy, up to 100 times what you would normally get in one dose. And they saturate your body with it. And then they re-inject your bone marrow in, and they wait. Number one, to see if you survive it. Number two, to see if your bone marrow will graft in again and begin to grow and produce your own blood again. And then number three, to see if they've gotten all the cancer cells in one fell swoop. Well, in my case, every time they drilled in there to take a plug out of bone marrow, it was chock full of cancer.
She was going through quite a hard time emotionally. I think it had begun to really impact her hard, and her health was really bad at that point because of all the chemicals. And she just carried on as best she could, but it was a very tough time.
So I was sent to Omaha, Nebraska. I was accepted there into the bone marrow transplant program. And what they did is they set me up next to this big pheresis machine, and I sat next to this machine for 4 hours every morning, and they pumped all of my blood through this machine. And after 2 weeks, they had saved up enough stem cells that normally grow inside of your bone marrow. And they saved it and they froze it. And then in preparation for what was to come next, they implanted 2 more tubes into my chest so that they could continually be pumping me full of things. And they put me in a special isolation room, and I ended up spending 52 days in isolation.
The smells were bad. The environment was bad. I always felt like there were secrets being held back from me. And I always went into the room with a great deal of fear and trembling. What would I find? How would my wife be doing? What would the next procedure be that they'd try? It was really difficult.
Over the course of the next few months, I received over 100 blood transfusions just to stay alive. And some of the things that happened in that room that Dave had to tell me later on, because I was so heavily drugged, was that my skin actually turned like brown leather because I was chemically burnt from the inside out. Also, every time I moved, I would throw up, just from the nausea of all the chemotherapy. And then I burst all the blood vessels in my eyes because I was coughing so much that I had no platelets because I wasn't making any of my own blood, and it was just like blood red. I was already shiny bald for a year, So that was nothing new. But then my fingernails and my toenails fell off too. And of course in my eyelashes, my eyebrows, and I tell you, I didn't look like myself at all.
She swelled all up, her face broke out, her body broke out. I don't think there was a square inch on her that wasn't covered in a rash. Her mouth and esophagus was all eaten away. She couldn't swallow. She was vomiting a lot, and it was a dreadful thing.
I always thought my mom was so pretty, and she looked dead. It was scary.
If I would have believed my natural eye, I would have believed that she was going to die. Her skin color was really bad. She was mostly gray and had the look of death about her.
And then my kidneys began to shut down, and I began to just balloon up because my kidneys weren't working anymore. And then the scariest thing of all happened, and that was that I got pneumonia. And I quit breathing out of one lung altogether. And the doctors were very worried then.
They came in the, I think, late afternoon, and they told us they were going to have to take her in for emergency surgery, that her kidneys were shutting down to about 50% already, and her both lungs were full, so they were going to have to go in and do an emergency thoracotomy. And at that point, I had just had it, and Ann was too weakened to really, I feel, know what was going on with her. So I lined the doctors up in the hall myself. And I said, you are going to have to explain to me why you're doing this to this girl who's already been to hell and back, why you're going to have to do it. And so basically it came down to the fact either we do it or she will die right now.
And they said that it doesn't look promising that she'll pull through this. So I went home and I had to tell the kids, and perhaps I told them that it looked like Mom might not live through the night.
The doctor said it was 1,000,000 to 1 chance. We all just sat down and prayed for a long time.
That was probably the longest night of my life, waiting to see and trying to explain to an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old that she just might not pull through this. This was really tough.
But we just sobbed and prayed and asked God to intervene. I remember writing in my journal that death was imminent.
And the surgeons went in and opened me up and had a look around in my lung and just really decided there was nothing more they could do, and sewed me back up again and sent me back to my room. And my mom, she swears that she heard angels' wings in my room that night. And the next day, we really think a miracle happened, because for no medical reason, I began to breathe on my own the next day. And as time went on, they drained my lung of all this stuff, and I began to gain back more strength. And I remember the doctor coming into my room, and of course to enter my room he had to wear a mask and gloves and booties and a gown and the whole bit. And she came in the room and she took my hand in her rubber gloves, and I noticed that she was crying. And she said, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Fromm, but the whole procedure just didn't work for you. We're very sorry, but it's hopeless."
Well, in a gentle yet direct way, they made known that the space was needed, and sent us home with the idea that live life normally. With the implication, although not spoken, was that they really didn't expect Ann to live very much longer. The cancer would be growing back quickly. She'd had all the chemo she could.
She was still very ill. Her eyes were all bloodshot, and her skin was all sallow, and she just looked like a dying person.
and I prayed for an answer. And the answer really came in the form of a book. Someone sent me a book on the link between nutrition and cancer. And I studied that book, and it made so much sense to me. And I went to the library to see if I could find some more information on nutrition and cancer. And I found a lot of information there. And the more I studied, the more it made sense to me that all of us, every one of us, have some cancer cells in our bodies. And it's our immune system that's constantly fighting that off. Well, it made that much sense to me that I decided what I wanted to do was to go on an immune building program, just to see if I could get that immune system working again. And I found myself a good nutritionist who was willing to take me on, who was going to just help me try to rebuild that immune system. And I remember the day before I was to start on this program, I had my 5-week checkup with my oncologist. And I remember after he finished his examination and he was writing some notes, I said, listen, I'm going to do this nutrition thing. And I remember he looked at me and he looked down at his chart and he said, your cancer has nothing to do with nutrition.
I don't know how anyone could actually say that. I look at cancer from a totally different standpoint. I look at it from the standpoint that it's an incredible toxemia in the body's inability to throw off dead cells, the body's inability to regenerate new cells. I truly believe that we are what we eat, and I don't know how anyone could say that.
It was a very intensive program that my nutritionist wanted to put me on.
I put Anne on a pretty serious detoxification program. I put her on 2 weeks of total juice cleansing, where she had to take high bulk intestinal cleansers 5 times a day, and then I had her do enemas twice a day. And then after the 2 weeks of cleansing, she still had to do 2 days of detoxification every week.
She knew that 40% of all cancer patients actually die of malnutrition. So she knew my body was actually starving to death.
If a person has a degenerative disease, it means the body is not regenerating itself. It means the body is not getting live enzymes in order to be able to heal itself.
So she was very concerned about me getting lots of nutrients into my body.
I approached it with a great deal of suspicion, but I actually, in this commitment to my wife to be one with her as a team in this battle, I went with her to all the appointments with the nutritionist. And as I listened and then began to read, it occurred to me that this was not voodoo, this was not strange stuff, but had a scientific basis behind it. And as I began to realize that, it became very clear to me that this is something I should do for myself as well.
You know, it was different. It wasn't anything I had ever heard of before, but I was sure excited for her and could see the effects of it almost immediately. Her countenance began to look better, and she had a more healthy glow around her face, and by then her eyes had pretty much healed. She was getting lots of the whites back in her eyes, and she had energy and was bubbly and vital.
At first, I felt worse before I felt better. I mean, I couldn't believe what began to happen. My body was kicking out all this toxic junk. I mean, the pores of my skin had chemotherapy coming out of it, and I could taste it on my tongue, and it would burn my skin as it came out. And I would actually have to take showers several times a day just to wash this stuff off of me.
Her body was changing in ways that we weren't quite sure why or what, but what she was doing was having an effect, and that was real exciting, that we could actually take hold of responsibility and do things to make progress.
Well, after the first 2 weeks, she started me on a program, a rebuilding program. I ate 80% fresh raw fruits and raw vegetables every day. And 20% of my diet consisted of things like whole grains. I could have baked potatoes, steamed vegetables, things like that. But we tried to maintain a diet that was largely raw foods, because what I was trying to do was to eat live enzymes in my food, because when we cook our foods, we destroy the enzymes in the food, and that was very important because enzymes help you digest your food, plus they break down that protein coating that surrounds each cancer cell. So then my body could destroy the cancer cells more easily.
Anne's belief system was so powerful. She was convinced that she was meant to be healed and that I was the vessel that was going to do it. And when I find people like that, they typically make it.
Well, after 5 weeks on this very intensive program, it was time for me to go in for my next checkup. And even though I committed myself to a 1.5 years intensively sticking with the program, I went into the doctor's, and he had already taken some blood work. And he walked in the door, and I'll never forget this. He said, "You've come to play Stump the Doctor, haven't you?" And he told me that he had found absolutely no trace of cancer in my body. I mean, his word was he was flabbergasted. But the first thing he decided to do was to do more tests. So he did some more blood work. He took a sample of my bone marrow, which had always shown a lot of cancer in it. And those also came back from the lab showing no trace of cancer in my body. I mean, even he said this had to be your diet or divine intervention. And we said both. We knew God had used this whole program to rebuild my natural immune system, to get it working again. Well, that was in 1990, and I have been cancer-free ever since.
Hi, I'm Dave Fromm. Thanks for having watched this film about my wife's struggle with breast cancer. In 1998, several years after the original production of the film, Ann did actually go home to be with Jesus. Iron toxicity, the result of the many blood transfusions she received during the bone marrow transplant she talked about on this video, did eventually shut her liver down, took her life.